There was a time when the glow of a Motown stage could make three young women from Detroit feel larger than life. The lights were warm, the air carried the pulse of a city on the rise, and somewhere in that golden haze stood a trio who would soon change American music forever. Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard were not legends yet, just girls with harmony in their bones, and a dream bigger than the Brewster Douglas projects they called home. But what happens when a group climbs higher than anyone ever imagined, only to discover that the brightest spotlight can cast the deepest shadows? Their journey would lift them into history, tear them apart, and leave a legacy the world still feels today. Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the world knew them as the Supremes, Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard were simply three young girls growing up in Detroit, surrounded by concrete buildings, factory noise, and the quiet determination of families trying to make a life during 1958. The Brewster Douglas housing projects, where all three lived at different times, was a place where dreams often felt distant. Yet it was also a place where music lived in every hallway and echoed through every open window. Florence Ballard stood out early. She had a warm, powerful voice, one that felt too big for the modest apartment where she practiced. Singing was her comfort, her way of making sense of a world that often felt limiting. Mary Wilson, gentle and observant, grew up in a household that encouraged music and structure. Her voice carried a smoothness that blended naturally with Florence's bold tone. The two became instant friends, connected by the simple joy of singing wherever they could. Across the street lived a girl named Diana Ross, soon to be known as Diana Ross. She was confident, determined, and fiercely focused on building a future bigger than anything around her. Diana studied performers on television, paying attention not only to how they sang, but how they stood, walked, and presented themselves. She wasn't just dreaming of fame, she was preparing for it. Everything began to shift in early 1958 when Florence met Paul Williams and Eddie Kendricks from the Primes. She sang for them on the spot, her voice clear and strong, and it caught the attention of their manager, Milton Jenkins. He had an idea: form a girl group to complement the Primes. Florence would be the anchor. She invited Mary to audition, knowing her voice would create the balance the group needed. Mary passed easily. When Jenkins asked for a third member, Mary immediately thought of Diana Ross. Soon, Florence, Mary, Diana, and Betty McGlone were rehearsing as the Primettes. They practiced anywhere they could: living rooms, school basements, front porches. Their first real moment of unity came during their audition for Jenkins, when they performed "The Nighttime is the Right Time" by Ray Charles. Florence led the melody, Mary found the harmonies, Betty grounded the low notes, and Diana added a high part that floated above everything else. When they finished, they all felt it. Something had clicked. They weren't just four girls singing. They were a group. The Primettes started performing at sock hops, church events, union halls, and small Detroit clubs. The pay was small, often just a few dollars, but the response from audiences was real. They shared stages with other young performers who would later become legends themselves, including future Temptation Otis Williams. Each show made them better, each rehearsal made their harmonies tighter, and each small victory made their dream feel a little closer. The girls studied the sounds around them. They were influenced by Ray Charles, gospel quartets, and the polished harmonies of the Drifters. When guitarist Marvin Tarplin joined them, their sound became richer and more defined. With him, their performances gained depth and professionalism far beyond their age. A major turning point came in July 1960 when they entered the Detroit International Freedom Festival talent competition. They won. That victory gave them confidence they had never felt before. They saw a path forming, and they were ready to follow it. At the same time, Motown was rising only a few blocks away. Founded by Berry Gordy, the label was becoming the heart of Detroit's musical identity. Smokey Robinson heard the Primettes and believed they had potential. Gordy agreed to let them audition. They impressed him, but he believed they were too young and needed to finish school first. The rejections stung, but it didn't stop them. Instead, it made them sharper, more focused, more determined. Because before the awards, before the fame, Before the world learned their names, they were simply Florence, Mary, and Diana, three Detroit girls chasing a dream together, long before they understood how big that dream would become. When the Primettes first stepped into the Detroit music scene, they were still just teenagers, balancing school books with late-night rehearsals and weekend performances. Nothing about their early years came easily. They were young, inexperienced, and constantly reminded that they were competing in a world built for adults with polished voices and established reputations. But Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross carried something different: persistence, hunger, a quiet confidence that grew stronger every time they stepped on stage. Their first major break came with a small opportunity at Lupine Records. It was not Motown, and it was not glamorous, but it was a chance to be heard. They recorded two singles, Tears of Sorrow and Pretty Baby. The songs did not chart, and they did not change the course of music history, but they taught the girls what it meant to work in a studio, to listen critically to their own voices, and to understand the discipline required to survive in the business. Even if the records failed commercially, they earned the group local attention. People in Detroit began to talk about the young girl group with drive and determination. By then, the girls had one goal: to reach Motown. The label was becoming the heartbeat of the city, a place where young black artists could imagine a future that once felt unreachable. But getting in was another story. They needed experience, polish, and something that made them stand out from the dozens of acts lining up outside Motown's doors. So they worked, they rehearsed endlessly, they performed wherever they could find space. When Motown artists like Marvin Gaye or Mary Wells needed background vocals or hand claps, the Primettes volunteered without hesitation. It was not glamorous work, but it gave them access to the studio environment, taught them discipline, and allowed the Motown staff to see their reliability up close. They were not stars yet, but they were becoming professionals. During this period, their lineup changed when Betty McGlown left and Barbara Martin joined, bringing stability for a moment before eventually stepping away. With her departure, Florence, Mary, and Diana became the trio the world would one day recognize. But at the time, they were still struggling for identity, still knocking on every door they could find, hoping someone inside the Motown building would finally say yes. In late 1961, their persistence paid off. Berry Gordy agreed to sign them, impressed not only by their voices but by their work ethic. However, he felt the name the Primettes sounded too youthful and lacked the sophistication he wanted for a Motown act. He handed Florence a list of possible names. Among them was one that stood out instantly: the Supremes. With a new name came new expectations. They were no longer just neighborhood girls. They were now part of a label that demanded excellence at every level. But the path forward was far from easy. From 1961 to 1963, the Supremes released several singles under Motown: I Want a Guy, Your Heart Belongs to Me, and A Breathtaking Guy. None of them made an impact on the national charts. Inside the Motown studio, they earned a new nickname, the No-Hit Supremes. It was a joke, but it carried weight. It reminded the group that despite their dedication, they had not proven themselves yet. Still, they refused to quit. They kept recording, kept performing, and kept believing. Because even in those early years, buried beneath the disappointment and uncertainty, there was something unmistakable about Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross, something waiting to rise. And soon, it finally would. By late 1963, the Supremes were tired. They had recorded song after song with little to show for it. They watched other Motown acts rise while they stayed in the background, smiling politely as people inside the company still called them the No-Hit Supremes. Yet beneath that frustration was a quiet fire. They had come too far to turn back, and they knew their moment had to come eventually. What they did not know was that Motown's most powerful creative force was about to step into their story. Holland, Dozier, and Holland, three men who would help define the sound of American pop music, began working with the Supremes at the end of the year. The trio of writers and producers had a gift for melody, rhythm, and structure. They could turn heartbreak into a catchy hook, tension into harmony, and longing into a timeless chorus. When they began crafting material for the Supremes, something shifted instantly. Their first true breakthrough came with When the Love Light Starts Shining Through His Eyes. It was energetic, polished, and full of the bright pop sound Motown wanted. For the first time, the Supremes landed a national hit. It was not number one, but it was enough. Enough to prove they belonged. Enough to show Berry Gordy that these three young women could carry a song with the same strength as any act on his roster. Yet the group's turning point was not just about one song. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define an era. Holland, Dozier, and Holland saw something in the trio that had not fully emerged. Diana Ross had a youthful clarity in her voice that cut through a mix. Mary Wilson added warmth and steadiness. Florence Ballard added richness and support. Together, they created a blend that was unmistakably theirs. Inside Motown, a sense of anticipation began to build. The Supremes worked harder than ever, rehearsing harmonies, refining choreography, and shaping a stage presence worthy of primetime television. They studied every detail of their performance, understanding that success in Motown was as much about poise and presentation as it was about vocal talent. Then came the song that would alter their lives forever. Holland, Dozier, and Holland had written a track intended for another Motown act, but when that group declined, the Supremes stepped in. The song was "Where Did Our Love Go?" At first, they did not like it. The melody felt simple, the arrangement repetitive, but they trusted the team, and they recorded it anyway. When the record was released, something unexpected happened. It soared to number one. Audiences connected instantly to Diana's soft lead vocal, the heartbeat-like rhythm, and the elegant harmonies that floated behind her. The Supremes had crossed a threshold. They were not the no-hit Supremes anymore. They were a rising force. The success of "Where Did Our Love Go?" became the beginning of a run that no one in the industry had predicted. With each new release, their confidence grew, their image sharpened, their ambition expanded. They were finally becoming what they had always believed they could be. For Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross, this was not just a turning point. It was the moment the world began to listen. And once the world heard them, it would never forget them. When the Supremes stepped into 1964, they crossed into a new world, one that felt nothing like the years of disappointment behind them. The success of "Where Did Our Love Go?" had cracked open a door, but no one expected what would come next. Almost overnight, Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross became the faces of a musical revolution. Their voices filled radios across America, their smiles lit up television screens, and their polished elegance made them stand out in an industry that rarely allowed young black women this kind of visibility. "Where Did Our Love Go?" climbed to number one with a speed that stunned even Motown. It was not just a hit, it became a cultural moment. The Supremes suddenly represented something larger than themselves. They were a symbol of hope, of possibility, of a changing America. People from every background found something familiar in their music, something comforting in the softness of Diana Ross's voice and the perfect balance of Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard behind her. The momentum did not stop. "Baby Love" followed, then "Come See About Me," then "Stop in the Name of Love," and "Back in My Arms Again." One after another, these songs reached number one. The Supremes became the first female group in American history to send 5 consecutive singles to the top of the Billboard chart. Their rise was no longer just impressive, it was historic. Television brought their presence to an even wider audience. When they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, they were prepared with practiced smiles, coordinated gowns, and choreography that flowed like silk. The camera adored them. America adored them. They carried themselves with a sophistication that set a new standard for girl groups, and they made it look effortless, even though nothing about their journey had ever been easy. Motown played a crucial role in their transformation. Berry Gordy believed in the power of presentation. Under his guidance, the Supremes trained in etiquette, public speaking, movement, and style. They became polished in a way that set them apart, earning comparisons to stars of Hollywood's golden age. Their gowns glistened under stage lights, their harmonies felt flawless, and their presence captured the glamour of a world that once felt out of reach. Behind the scenes, Florence, Mary, and Diana worked tirelessly to maintain that image. They rehearsed until their harmonies blended like a single voice. They practiced their stage entrances and exits, making sure each performance felt like a complete experience. They understood that being on top meant holding themselves to a higher standard. They were not just performers anymore. They were ambassadors for a new era in black music. By the mid-1960 period, the Supremes were global stars. They toured internationally, drawing crowds who had only heard their voices through records. Audiences in Europe and beyond embraced them with the same enthusiasm found in America. Suddenly, three young women from Detroit were standing on stages thousands of miles from home, shining with a confidence they had earned through years of persistence. This was the height of their success, the moment when Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross stood as the most successful female group in the world. Their dreams had not only come true, they had exceeded them. For a brief and brilliant time, the Supremes were untouchable, wrapped in the glow of fame, music, and history. They were on top of the world. For all the beauty and precision the Supremes projected under the lights, there was a growing tension beneath the polished exterior. Success had elevated them to the top of American music, but it also created cracks that no amount of choreography or elegance could hide. As the spotlight grew brighter on Diana Ross, the shadows around Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson began to deepen. Berry Gordy saw something extraordinary in Diana. Her voice, her presence, her poise. He believed she could become a global star, someone who could carry the Motown brand far beyond the boundaries of Detroit. Gradually, he began shaping the group around her. Decisions that once involved all three members were now filtered through Diana's rising status. Song assignments, public appearances, even media coverage began to tilt in her direction. At first, the shift was subtle. Then it became unmistakable. Florence Ballard felt it most. She had founded the group, chosen its members, and carried a voice powerful enough to rival any singer at Motown. But the industry valued a different kind of sound, one that Diana happened to deliver with effortless clarity. As Diana took on more lead vocals, Florence found herself stepping back, not because she lacked talent, but because the machinery around her no longer supported her place at the front. The imbalance grew heavier with every new hit. The breaking point came when Gordy announced a significant change. The group would now be called Diana Ross and the Supremes. The message could not have been clearer. What had once been a trio built on friendship and harmony was slowly becoming a vehicle for a single star. Florence felt the loss deeply, not only as an artist but as a person watching pieces of her identity slip away. Mary Wilson tried to hold the center, but even she could feel the shift pulling them apart. Behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. Endless tours, strict schedules, and the expectations of fame weighed heavily on all three women. Florence struggled the most. What the public saw as glamour was, for her, a reminder of what she was losing. The more Diana rose, the more Florence felt herself fading. She began to miss rehearsals and recording sessions, overwhelmed by a sadness she could not escape. Critics and outsiders whispered about her, often without compassion or understanding. But those who knew her understood she was fighting a quiet battle, one made harder by the very success she had helped create. The Supremes were still shining on stage, but behind closed doors, the harmony that once defined them was slowly coming undone. The moment Florence Ballard began to slip from the center of the Supremes was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible at first, the kind of shift only someone living inside the storm could truly feel. For years, Florence had been the heart of the group, the girl who gathered the members, the voice that once anchored their earliest harmonies, the spirit that believed they could rise long before anyone else did. But as Diana Ross continued to move into the spotlight, Florence found herself fighting a battle she never expected to face, the feeling of becoming a stranger inside her own dream. What the world did not see was how deeply she internalized the changes happening around her. Being pushed out of lead vocals, watching the group name change, standing on stage while cameras focused almost exclusively on Diana, each moment chipped away at her confidence. Florence had always been proud, always carried herself with strength. But fame has a way of bending even the strongest souls. She felt replaced, overlooked, and increasingly isolated within the group she had helped create. The pressure inside Motown only intensified the emotional weight she carried. Schedules were packed, expectations were high, and mistakes were not forgiven easily. Every missed note or cracked harmony felt magnified under the strict discipline that defined Motown's studio culture. While the world celebrated the Supremes for their perfection, Florence struggled with the reality that perfection came at the cost of her place in the group. As the months passed, she began to withdraw. Friends noticed that the brightness in her personality had dimmed. Recording sessions became harder. She arrived late, sometimes unable to face the music that once brought her joy. She missed rehearsals and performances, not out of carelessness, but because she felt overwhelmed by something she had no words for. Depression, though not widely understood or discussed during that time, wrapped itself tightly around her life. To cope, Florence turned to alcohol. It was never about glamour or indulgence. It was about escape, an attempt to numb the helplessness she felt as she watched her role shrink day by day. Some people judged her harshly, unaware of the emotional wounds that had pushed her toward drinking. Years later, those close to her would speak out, insisting that the world never understood the pain behind her struggle. Inside the group, the tension grew impossible to hide. Diana and Mary tried to move forward with the demands of their schedule, but they, too, saw the fractures forming. The unity that had once defined the Supremes was weakening. The sisterhood they had built through years of rehearsing, dreaming, and fighting to be heard was beginning to unravel. By mid-1967, Florence's absence became too frequent to ignore. Her emotional state had deteriorated, and the atmosphere around her felt heavy with things unsaid. The girl who once stood so confidently on the front porch of the Brewster Douglas projects, believing she could take on the world, was now battling a private darkness no one knew how to fix. And in the end, the crisis that had been building quietly for so long would push her toward a decision that changed everything, not just for Florence Ballard, but for the Supremes as a whole. When Florence Ballard finally reached the point where she could no longer remain in the group, the decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. The Supremes had become a machine moving forward at full speed, and Florence, once the engine of that dream, could no longer keep pace. Motown stepped in, quietly arranging for Cindy Birdsong to replace her. It happened with a swiftness that stunned those who had watched the group grow from neighborhood girls into national icons. For Florence, it marked the end of a chapter she had never imagined closing so painfully. Her departure signaled the beginning of a new era, but it was also the moment when the harmony that once defined the Supremes fractured beyond repair. Diana Ross, already positioned as the lead star, continued her ascent with Berry Gordy guiding every step. Mary Wilson tried to keep the remaining pieces together, but the balance that once held them steady had shifted permanently. The trio that had risen together was no longer the same. Motown moved forward quickly. With Florence gone, the group's identity transformed. Concerts continued. Recordings continued. Television appearances continued. But behind the elegant gowns and practiced smiles, the absence of Florence's presence lingered like a quiet shadow. Something essential had been lost, even if the world did not yet know it. The years that followed placed even greater pressure on the group. As Diana Ross's fame soared, Motown began preparing her for a solo career. It was a plan that had been forming long before the public could see it. By the end of the decade, the transition became official. In early 1970, Diana performed her final show with the Supremes, stepping away from the group that had carried her into the national spotlight. The Supremes continued without her, now led by Jean Terrell, and for a brief moment, they found success with songs that proved the group still had strength beyond its most famous member. But the constant lineup changes, the lack of consistent promotion, and the shifting focus of Motown made it nearly impossible for the new version of the group to hold the same cultural weight. Members rotated in and out, each one talented but unable to recreate the chemistry that once existed between Florence, Mary, and Diana. By the mid-1970 period, it became clear that the group's era was fading. Without any original members, the identity of the Supremes began to blur. In 1977, the group disbanded quietly, without the national fanfare that had once surrounded their rise. The silence that followed was telling. A chapter in American music history had closed, not with applause, but with the soft, almost unspoken truth that even the greatest harmonies can unravel when the people behind them grow apart. Long before history books wrote their names in gold, the impact of the Supremes had already taken root in the hearts of millions. What Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross created together was far more than a string of #1 hits or a list of awards. They reshaped the cultural identity of American music. They opened doors that had been closed for generations. And they showed the world what it looked like when 3 young black women stepped onto a stage and refused to be overlooked. The Supremes were the first female vocal group in the United States to reach a level of success that rivaled major pop acts. They did not simply become popular, they became a phenomenon. Their sound blended gospel roots, pop brightness, and the unmistakable smoothness of Motown's production. It was a sound that traveled through radios in living rooms, kitchen windows, factory floors, and long highways. People who had never stepped foot in Detroit felt connected to them. Their music was simple, honest, and deeply human. Their influence went far beyond their charts. They transformed the idea of what a girl group could be. Before the Supremes, female groups were often placed in the background, supporting instead of leading. But the Supremes stood at the center of the stage. They wore gowns that shimmered beneath stage lights. They carried themselves with a poise that reflected discipline, grace, and pride. And they showed an entire generation that representation mattered. For young black women watching them on television, the Supremes were more than performers. They were a mirror, a confirmation that beauty, elegance, and success belonged to them too. Many artists who later became icons of the 1970 period and beyond openly credited the Supremes as the spark that inspired their careers. Groups like The 3 Degrees, The Emotions, The Pointer Sisters, En Vogue, TLC, and Destiny's Child did not simply follow the Supremes. They built upon the foundation Florence, Mary, and Diana laid down. Their legacy also reached into film and theater. Stories inspired by their rise and struggles emerged in productions like Sparkle in 1976 and later in 2012, along with the musical Dreamgirls in 1981 and the feature film adaptation in 2006. These stories captured the essence of the Supremes: the beauty, the ambition, the heartbreak, and the resilience. Even when fictionalized, the influence was unmistakable. What made their legacy timeless was not only the music, but the emotional truth behind it. The Supremes represented the triumphs and tensions of their era. They emerged during a time when America was facing deep social change. Their success crossed racial lines at a moment when the country needed symbols of unity. Their harmonies, their presence, and their courage allowed them to become more than entertainers. They became cultural ambassadors for a movement larger than themselves. Years later, when critics and historians look back at the evolution of American music, the Supremes stand as a turning point. A reminder that sometimes the most important revolutions do not begin with protests or speeches, but with three young women standing side by side, singing with everything they have. As the years passed and the music industry continued to evolve, the world slowly began to look back on the Supremes with a deeper, more thoughtful appreciation. Time has a way of softening the noise and leaving behind only the truth, and the truth was simple. Their influence had woven itself into the fabric of American culture. Long after their final performance in 1977, people still played their records, still studied their harmonies, still felt the emotion behind every lyric they recorded. Recognition began to come in waves. In 1988, the original Supremes were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a milestone that confirmed what many fans had always known. They were not just successful performers, they were pioneers. In 1994, they received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, placed among the giants whose work shaped the entertainment world. Their songs found new life as the decades turned, earning places in the Grammy Hall of Fame for Where Did Our Love Go and You Keep Me Hanging On in 1999, and Stop in the Name of Love in 2001. In 2023, they were honored with the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, a tribute that acknowledged both their artistry and their enduring impact on global music. But even as their music lived on, the people behind the songs faced the passing of time in their own ways. Betty McGlown died in 2008 at age 66. Florence Ballard, whose voice had once carried the heart of the group, died far too young in 1976 at age 32. Barbara Martin passed in 2020 at age 76. Mary Wilson, the steadfast anchor who remained with the Supremes through every rise and fall, died in 2021 at age 76. Each loss felt like another chapter closing, another reminder of the fragility behind the fame. And yet, despite the heartbreak, their story continues to resonate. The Supremes left behind more than recordings. They left behind a legacy that speaks to perseverance, ambition, and the power of believing in a dream even when the world doubts you. Critics revisit their discography with newfound respect. Younger generations discover their performances and find themselves drawn to the elegance and sincerity of their work. Fans, old and new, revisit their music not only for nostalgia but for the reassurance it brings. In the end, the world came to understand what their voices had been saying all along. They were more than a girl group. They were a cultural landmark. And though time has passed, their music still stands as proof that some harmonies never fade. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it, the distant echo of a Motown stage, the soft shimmer of a gown catching the light, the gentle harmony of three voices rising together as if the world were holding its breath. It is the same image we began with, the same feeling that carried Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross from the Brewster Douglas Projects to the pinnacle of American music. Their story began with hope, swayed through triumph, and fell into heartbreak. Yet what remains is not the pain, it is the resonance, the part of them that never stopped singing. The Supremes were more than chart-topping artists. They were young women who dared to believe that dreams could lift them beyond the limits placed around them. They took stages they were never supposed to stand on. They broke barriers they were never expected to cross. And in doing so, they changed the way America listened, watched, and imagined what was possible. For Florence Ballard, the journey ended far too soon. Yet her legacy lives in every bold, heartfelt note she ever sang. For Mary Wilson, the group became a lifelong testament to strength and loyalty. For Diana Ross, it became the foundation of a career that reached global heights. Together, they formed a story shaped by courage, conflict, and an undeniable brilliance that time could never erase. And even though their voices are now part of history, people still return to the music, to the sweetness of Baby Love, the ache of Where Did Our Love Go, the power of Stop in the Name of Love. These songs have outlived every headline, every rumor, every hardship. They remain because they speak to something timeless, something deeply human. In the quiet moments, when the applause fades and the room grows still, their harmonies linger as a reminder that greatness is rarely simple, that behind every polished performance lies a lifetime of effort, sacrifice, and dreams, and that some stories deserve to be remembered not just for their glory, but for their humanity. So now the question falls to you. Do you think Hollywood ever gave the Supremes the respect they truly deserved? If this story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which song you remember most. Tell us what their music meant in your life. And if you believe stories like theirs should never be forgotten, hit that subscribe button and help us keep the light of these legends alive. Because the Supremes were more than stars. They were reminders of what happens when hope, harmony, and heart come together and leave the world forever changed.